Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to talk about eye dominance. Just basically described, eye dominance is one of your eyes is going to be the dominant eye. It's in the name, right? What that means is that eye is going to want to guide whatever laterality you are, which means if you're left-handed, your dominant eye is going to be the guiding eye for your left-handed movement, but it's both hands. When it comes to shooting, it's a concern because it's going to guide that dominant hand. There is no connection between what eye is dominant and what hand is dominant, which means there's no connection between laterality and hand and eye dominance. I am cross-dominant, which is something you hear sometimes. There are some shooters out there, myself, I know Bill Blowers is as well, and I've had the occasional student that is also blessed with that somewhat quasi-superhuman ability. What that means is I shoot handgun with one dominant hand and I shoot rifle with a different dominant hand. So in my case, I'm primarily a left-handed shooter when it comes to handguns, but I shoot rifle right-handed. But I am right-eye dominant, so it actually works out pretty well for me on the rifle. I don't have to retrain myself or deal with some of the issues that come from people who are right-handed but left-eye dominant. Where it got me into a trouble when I first started shooting handguns, which was a long, long time ago, but I still remember the frustration that I initially had, was my dominant eye was on the wrong side of the body for my dominant hand. So right-eye dominant, left-handed handgun shooter. This is something I address in classes, and I think it's a bit of a boogeyman, but it's definitely something that I feel like needs to be talked about. I've had a lot of questions about it recently, actually, just for some reason they all kind of clustered up at the same time. So I figured I'd do a video on it and best tricks, tips, and advice on smoothing out the issue of your dominant eye and your dominant hand being on different sides of the body. The biggest place you're going to run into an issue with eye dominance with the handgun is a handgun with iron sights. Just based on the nature of the way that the sights need to be used, it's going to be much more frustrating than it will be if you're using a projected optic such as a red dot. The reason the issue presents and becomes frustrating is because, like I said, when I'm using a handgun, I've got to be able to guide that gun in front of the dominant eye. And if I'm left-handed, that means that I'm probably going to have to push the gun in front of the dominant eye. So me as primarily a left-handed handgun shooter, I'm not going to come straight out in front, even though I can still acquire the optic. The gun is going to be pushed slightly to the right. But here's the thing. This is not something that we need to spend a lot of time overthinking. Like I said in the beginning of the video, the dominant hand is going to lead where the dominant eye is telling it to go. So if my brain says, get a sight picture, then that's what's going to happen. My proprioception, which is my body's ability to know where my hands are at any given time, even without me physically guiding them, so I'm able to do things and reach places on my body because my body knows where everything's at. And also my alignment based on eye-hand coordination. So if I'm looking at my target, I'm like, okay, time to draw the gun, time to get my sight picture. The gun should naturally drive to that dominant eye. And I think some people get frustrated with the fact that they think that they have to do something dramatically different in order to get the sight picture sight alignment that they need. So they're thinking, okay, I've got to bring the gun way over to my dominant eye and then I can get my sight picture. Let the gun be guided the way that it wants to be guided. Let your body do what it naturally does. This is no different than what you do in a daily life. Your dominant eye is always your dominant eye. It's not just about shooting. We just notice it more in shooting. If I'm reaching for something, if I'm picking something up, if I'm making adjustments, if I'm screwing something in, if I'm building something, if I'm working a hammer, if I'm throwing a ball, throwing a javelin, you kind of get the point now, right? The dominant eye is the dominant eye. The issue comes in when we start working through multiple focal planes and maybe we're a novice or a beginning shooter, or we've been given bad advice, and because we're talking about shooting, the likely cause of your problems may be that last one. If your only visual issue is eye dominance versus hand dominance, which laterality you are, then you probably don't have any other issues you have to deal with. Now, if you have to wear corrective lenses, that shouldn't be a factor. The only caveat that I've seen is people with an astigmatism, and that's usually in regards to using like a red dot optic. When it comes to using iron sights, another potential issue that could arise is contrast between the two sighting surfaces. Are you using fiber, or using night sight, or using all black? And then lighting conditions are a factor as well. So if I'm using all black sights and I'm aiming in reduced lighting, or if I'm getting sun in my eyes as I'm aiming, everyone's going to have an issue with that. It's not just going to just be because your hand and your eye are on different sides of the body when it comes to shooting. Also, sight radius can be a factor. If I'm using a smaller gun like a Glock 26 versus a Glock 34, it's harder for me to negotiate sight alignment based on lighting conditions, based on which sights I'm using, than it would otherwise be. So to me, at 26, the sights tend to stack together and it's hard to maintain that front sight focus. The human eye is very lazy. It wants to focus on the most interesting thing in front of it. So if I'm shooting an irons only gun, I highly recommend there be some kind of contrast between that front sight and the rear sight. If it's a department issued gun and you've got to use the sights you've got to use, chances are you have night sights, which means you have a little green tritium vial up front, 2 little green tritium vials in the back. So contrast isn't as bad as it would be on just all black sights, because black makes it harder to deal with. But you're still going to have that issue where your eye may get focus confused, which means it keeps bouncing back and forth between these two sights. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being cross-dominant. You know, your dominant hand and your dominant eye, different sides of the body. That's just a visual confusion that arises from the human eye wanting to pay attention to the most interesting thing in front of it, and the fact that we just get used to bouncing back and forth. Some people shoot with a very soft focus, which means they're pressed out and they focus on their front sight once they've established sight alignment, sight picture, and then their eyes just kind of float somewhere between the two sights where they're shooting, so neither of them are really in focus, or they're kind of focused on the target. Their reaccommodation of the eye has picked a focal distance and it's just going to use it. You can be very accurate with that if you know what you're doing. If you train with it, you practice with it. But if there's no contrast between the two sights, you have to come up with a practice methodology that's going to allow you to still use the sights that you have to use. If it's your gun, your choice, then by all means get some kind of contrast between your front and your rear sights, and that's going to significantly help improve your shooting ability. There's not a lot you can do physiologically when it comes to iron sights based on how you see versus go to the eye doctor, get your eyes checked, and see if your vision actually is 20/20 or whatever. Make sure that you're working there. If your eye dominance is so bad that even though, you know, you've got the gun lined up with your dominant eye and you're still seeing two guns, or you're still seeing that front sight drift around, or you're seeing the fact like I can't front sight focus. I keep focusing on my rears, I keep focusing on my rears, I keep focusing on my rears. Contrast is going to be a very good way to overcome that. But another good way to overcome it is make sure that you're not actually inclining your head and trying to line your gun up with a turned head. If I turn my head and then have to turn my eye back to see the sights, I'm really defeating the purpose of what I'm trying to do, because the eye is still in the same position of alignment even though I've moved my head. So if you do turn your head and the only issue you have is eye dominance, some people with astigmatisms have to turn their head with red dot sights. And iron sights, I've never really seen it. If someone has told you to turn your head, they've given you bad advice. So here's 2 tricks that you can use to see how or if eye dominance is actually the problem you're having when you're shooting. First thing's very easy. Pick a target and write a word on it. Cat, dog, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious if the target's wide enough or you write small enough. What you want to be able to be is be able to read the word clearly. So make sure it's printed very, very clear, very legible. Then you're going to draw the gun and you're going to present and see if you can read the word. If you're using iron sights and you can read the word, then you're not front sight focused. So we've eliminated that as potential. People who use front only fibers or front only night sights sometimes think that they're front sight focused, when in actuality they're target focused, but they just don't really see the difference, which can be based on any number of factors, lighting conditions, environment, whatever. The next thing that you can do is see if your dominant eye is really super, super dominant. And the best way, the easiest way to do that is with both eyes open, present the gun, get your sight picture, sight alignment, and then close the eye that you feel is not your dominant eye. If you still have proper sight picture, proper alignment, then yeah, you're right. If you don't, then there's some kind of visual relationship that's going on. Sometimes your eyes are 60-40, if we're going to use kind of that terminology or that analogy. There is no strict definitive dominant eye. Some people are neutral too. They can use either eye. With a handgun, using iron sights, it's kind of difficult for me to switch from my right to my left eye. It takes me a little bit longer. With a red dot projected optic, it's super easy. In fact, at this point in my shooting life, I don't notice a time lag between using one or the other eye. But those are 2 methods that you can find or you can use to see how much of an issue you really have in dealing with your eye dominance with iron sights. The best advice I can really give you, though, is put a red dot on your gun. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, here he goes again with that red dot stuff. Yeah, here I go again with that red dot stuff. This is the most natural, physiological way for the body to acquire a sight picture and shoot, is a projected one focal plane sighting system. I stare at the target and I superimpose the red dot over my desired point of aim. For people with astigmatisms, red dots can be problematic. If you're not going to get LASIK, or you can't get LASIK for whatever reason, then your red dot is going to appear in multiple different ways. No two astigmatisms that I've seen with students that have them have ever been quite the same. Some people see a little check mark, some people see 3 dots, some people see a starburst. Experimenting with dot size or just getting used to what your sight picture looks like for you can help overcome that. So there's people with astigmatisms that shoot red dot guns just fine because they've put in the work to find out what their sight picture does for them and what it doesn't do for them and what right is supposed to look like. If I have an eye dominance cross like I'm talking about, right eye, left hand, which is me, I'm looking at the target, which means I'm relying specifically on eye-hand coordination. I'm presenting the gun to that eye-hand coordination, which means the gun is going to guide to the dominant eye. It's going to be to me, the gun is going to be slightly right. But even if I move the gun left, extreme left side of my face, I can still use that dot. Now, depending on the target, if I'm aimed at a target here and I move the gun way over here, but I'm still using my right eye, I'm no longer aimed at that target. So target, distance, those things factor in as well. We don't need to overthink this, which is going to be kind of ironic because this video is probably going to be longer than you would think with me saying something like we don't need to overthink this. But I feel like I needed to explain why we don't need to overthink it. If you are having eye dominance issues, you have to do a mental checklist. Okay, what am I focusing on and why? And this is iron sights or red dot. Am I getting front sight focus? Am I staying target focused if I'm using a red dot? During recoil, is my eye changing its focal accommodation? Am I coming back to my rear sight, or on a red dot, am I coming back and staring at the dot? The human eye wants to focus on the most interesting thing in front of it. So the most interesting thing in front of it may not be a color, such as a front fiber or a front night sight or the target. It may be what's closer to it because it's right in front of your face. And how many rounds are you dedicating to fixing the problem? When I went through my first police academy, there were a lot of guys that had trouble with this, and that's mainly because they were new shooters, and some of them were given incorrect or inefficient advice on how to overcome being left-handed with a right eye dominance or left eye dominance right-handed. And some of them were told, oh, well, you need to shoot with your other hand, which is absolutely bullshit. What you need to do is put in the dedicated time in order to overcome the issue, because there are no free rides and there's no easy fixes for something like your body's basic designed physiology. Think about it like this. If I am right eye dominant and left-handed, as I am, do you think that I can overcome, let's say we go back to my first academy. You think I could overcome 26 years of life in 41 hours of firearms? Because that's how much at my first academy I had, 41 hours of firearms. A little bit more than that. So I'm going to use 41 hours of not just shooting, but firearms related stuff to overwrite 26 years of eye-hand coordinated programming and everything else I did in my life. It doesn't work like that. And am I going to be given the opportunity and the ability to dedicate however long it's going to take for me to overcome that programming? No. So I need to find a way to get the sights, red dot or iron sights, to work with my natural eye-hand coordination. And that really comes down to presentation and adherence to what you're seeing and be able to diagnose or identify what changes you need to make based on conscious, deliberate practice. All in all, overcoming cross-laterality, or I should say cross-dominance, is going to be much easier with a red dot. But if you're just not sold on it, or you can't afford one, or you're just getting into shooting and iron sights are what you got, or you're carrying a gun that you can't put a dot on, whatever your concern is, there's nothing wrong with iron sights. They are just harder to use if you have an extreme eye dominance issue. Some people are so eye dominant that when they try to shoot with their other eye, they don't see the gun. They don't see the sights, they don't see the dot, they don't see whatever sighting system they're using because their dominant eye is doing all of the work. Now that can be equaled out if you're willing to invest the time. If you're willing to wear an eye patch over your dominant eye an hour a day, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes a day, you're going to go a long way towards kind of not getting rid of your dominance problem, but you're going to ease it out because you're going to force that other eye to do some of the work, carry some of the load. When it comes to presentation, kind of talked about this already. The biggest problem with iron sights that I see with eye dominance, cross dominance issues is the eye's visual confusion of going back from target to front sight to rear sight, and then they'll fire 1 or 2 rounds and be like, oh, I'm staring at my rear sights. Overcoming that is making sure, doing that visual check of I'm going to stay front sight focused. If you present the gun and the sights are out of alignment because you can't see the front sight because your eyes are visually confused, you may need to push that gun more lined up with your dominant eye. Once you do that, the sight picture is going to start to feel more natural, it's going to be more efficient, and you're going to stop, at a certain point, stop having to consciously focus on making sure you push the gun one way or the other. I'm at the point now where I present the gun, I get the sights, and that's based on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sight presentations and twice or 3 times as many of that probably rounds fired. When we talk about conscious sight presentation, deliberate practice. How do I deliberately practice to make sure that my cross laterality or cross dominance is not creating issues and I'm going to be able to overcome the problems that I may be having? Dry fire. Don't do dry fire with trigger presses. Just do dry fire with sight presentations and changing target presentations. Set up 5 or 6 things to shoot at in your house, not actual live fire, of course, unless you can do that, but 5 things to point the gun at. As Frank Proctor likes to say, shooting is visual, which is like, well, that's common sense, but that's actually really smart because shooting ultimately is visual. The fundamentals on the back end of the gun are still just as important, but if you can't see, you can't shoot. And if you can't get a sight picture, and you can't put the sight picture where you need to get it, you can't hit what you want to hit. So some of the things that we need to practice on in dry fire aren't just our trigger control, aren't just our grip, aren't just our sub-second beep draw stroke. How good are you at visually processing what you're going to shoot? How good are you acquiring your sight picture as efficiently as possible without any wasted motion, without any wasted fishing? So you can overcome that cross dominance issue certainly by getting more and more reps. My advice to anyone who is newer to shooting, maybe you're going through the police academy or something like that, is spend as much time as you can every night working on that sight presentation, just the sight presentation. Don't worry about trigger presses. You can do that later, isolate that as its own skill set. But if we're deliberately practicing overcoming eye dominance issues, just worry about the iron sights, the sight alignment, the sight picture. If you don't have any ability to introduce contrast into those sights, that's unfortunate, but it's still something you can overcome. I prefer a fiber front. That's my preferred sighting system if I'm going to use irons only. But if you got to use night sights, at least there's some contrast there. And if you have to, you can take something and tape the rear sight initially. Don't stick with it, don't let it be a crutch, but it's something you can do initially to create a contrast between that front sight and those rear sights. If you have black and black, you can take a piece of blue painter's tape or white masking tape and put that on that front sight so you start getting used to focusing on that front sight. And that may be the most efficient fix that you can have. If you're able to choose whatever sights you want, my advice to you is make sure that your front sight and your rear sights have extreme contrast. If you don't want to deal with any of that, and you're able to, just get a red dot. Overcome that initial aversion to shooting one, and start working on the physical eye-hand coordination, because ultimately eye-hand coordination is what allows shooting to be visual. And if I'm having issues, pay attention to the advice you're being given and make sure it's going to be effective. Turning your head is not a solution. Changing which eye you shoot with, barring a significant reason to do so other than just being cross-dominant, is not a solution. It's an easy fix for a lazy instructor or an instructor who just doesn't know any better because he's just teaching you what he was taught, so on, so forth, so on, so forth. You have to rely as much as possible on what's natural if you can, because that's what you're going to be most efficient at. And even though guns are not natural, eye-hand coordination is. So let's make the gun work within our eye-hand coordination as naturally as possible versus trying to change what we have more experience with. I'm Eric Allen with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.